My name is Carl Quo, and this is Founder Quest, a podcast about the journeys of starting a game studio. On today's episode, we talk with Bernard Yee, founder of Windup Minds. Bernie has a long history in the games industry, working at such places as SOE, Atari, Bungie, Popcap, and more. But immediately prior to starting Windup Minds, he was working at Oculus, building early VR experiences. It was through that journey that he found the seed of what he wanted to continue as he started up Windup Minds. He shares how he found his co-founders and thought about all the assets he did and did not have for his founder's journey as he started it. I loved so much of how Bernie thinks about his journey and reflects on it. I hope you will too. Let's jump in. The place I often start and always love to learn about from different people and their journeys is there was a moment where you sort of mentally and emotionally committed to like, this isn't just maybe I'll do a startup. This is, no, I'm doing a startup and I'm 100% in. Tell me about that moment for you and, a little bit of what led into it, but what really tipped you over that edge to be fully in on this founding journey?
That's an interesting question. I feel like I didn't have that moment. Like I almost felt like I felt like a frog in boiling water, right? Like I think I've in retrospect, I've always been a prime candidate for it. I mean, my background is a producer with a little design knowledge, and I've always been driven by figuring out the best way to do things, the optimum way to do things, how to be more efficient, how to make the right decisions, and really taking ownership of whether that shit worked out or not, right? If it worked out, great. If I didn't work out, also on me. So I think I had the right mindset. And when I was laid off from Meta, from Facebook, Meta, Oculus, in November of 22, I took inventory of what I had done and what my value was in, what is a capitalist society, right? And I realized a couple things is that sometimes you don't realize the value of the things you built inside a company until you leave it and you get some perspective. So I realized that my team had done some amazing things inside the company, inside Reality Labs, Oculus. But I also realized that there's a half-life, a shelf life on those things. Like the farther along you go, the more people forget. So I realized taking it kind of like looking at our backlog, right, is we had a bunch of stuff and they start to rot. I also had as much as I am bummed about being laid off, they gave me a good severance package, and being at Oculus for 9 years, like I had saved a little money, and I had met a lot of people. And it's one of the things that I think I've always been has always worked for me is I've met a lot of great people in my career. So having this sort of hive mind of possible people you want to work with again gives you the sort of, there are people who I want to work with again. There's things I had shipped that have relevance and notoriety, like in the venture capital community, people who fund mixed reality and virtual reality. They all know my stuff, right? So I had all these sort of ingredients, and I had the catalyzing moment of being laid off was like, well, do I want to go back to take a job? Or do I put my money where my mouth is, right? If you're always saying you can do something better, well, then do something better. And I think at that moment, a couple of people whispered in my ear, like, hey, do you want to start something? A few people I knew who I really liked were available and were interested. And I had this kind of, do I really want to go back to the grind again? I also had a former manager who was my manager at PopCap, Alan Murray, he started a studio, Adam Jack, and they never shipped, but Alan went on to head a private division. So there definitely, I had other colleagues at Oculus who built the Ironwood Studios. They shipped Pacific Drive, right? So I had enough kind of people around me who had done it or doing it or gave me advice. So I felt like there's all this kind of groundswell of support. So all these things kind of lined up, and I found myself putting a pitch deck together, right? So I think it was that moment where I got, I took inventory of where my career was and what I had after my layoff. And I'm like, I don't need to go back to work. I can build something myself, right? And that's what really helped.
Yeah. One of the things that I think I'm curious about your perspective on is I think, especially now with the way the industry has sort of trended over the last few years with all the layoffs and everything else, like there's a consistent sort of perspective that crops up where it's like, oh, people who got laid off should just go and, be indie devs or go start their own studio or all the startup stuff. And as someone who's sort of, been on that journey and done that thing, regardless of whether you did it because someone gave you advice to do it or because you discovered the right path, right? What is sort of your take, and how would you temper that advice or that sort of sentiment that people will throw out?
I think being a founder of a studio, whether it's a studio of 1 or 2 or a studio of 15 or 30, is a little bit of a microcosm of the ability to be in the industry in the first place. And that is, it requires an inordinate amount of privilege to do this. I have privilege in that I worked at Meta for a number of years and I got stock and I have enough money that, in the event of a disaster, I'm not going to lose my home. I don't have, I can retire tomorrow money, but like I'm fairly comfortable. And I can take that chance. There's an unnamed former Valve developer who I used to be friends with. But he kind of wrote this screed on TikTok he was criticizing people who are using Twitter and other platforms where he and I don't agree with the political outlook. And he was basically saying, finger wagging at people who are using Twitter for their social outreach for their games. And he was at Valve for a number of years. So clearly he has money, right? And I felt like I get the sentiment, but who are you to tell somebody how they put food on the table? And in the same way, I get the sentiment of saying, like, you can be an indie developer. Maybe you can vibe code now and, you don't need to have a CS degree. But like, who am I to tell someone what sort of risks they should take with their lives? So if you have the privilege and the resources, and then there's another part I'll get to. Sure, you can do that. But if you want stability, if you want a paycheck, if you want health insurance, there's nothing wrong with being intentional about working again and maybe figuring out, all right, I'm going to extract some value from my next job that will get me down the line of starting my own studio, like whether it's learning or shipping or being in the public more or working on my storytelling, saving money, like all those things can be done. But I don't think it's fair to put that pressure on somebody and say, you should do this, because everyone has a different set of struggles and priorities about their personal life. And I would never presume to tell someone that this is what they should do. I would say this is what you could do. And the other thing too is like running a studio. I think the worst job is the CEO, right? I spent yesterday filling out an R&D tax credit application so that my company can get, you know this, right? Like, so we can get a little tax credit from and it was not an insubstantial amount of money. It was something like $100,000 tax return. But it is thankless work, right? Everyone's playing the build and like, we're looking and we're, our pet's doing this thing. And I'm like sitting there typing in, importing payroll and writing justification. Like, it's not pleasant work. And I think that that's the other thing is, even if you want to do this, you have to ask yourself, like, are you ready to take on the thankless tasks, of which are legion, to start this? Because it's not just about sitting down and writing a game. Maybe it is for some people, but if you really want to like build a team and incorporate and run it, do things the right way, right? That is a ton of work. And if you're not ready to do that work, then I would, ask people, what do you really want out of your, being in indie studio is a means to an end. What is that end that you want? So I think that's how I feel about it. It is, I don't know. I have a good friend of mine who was a CTO, a woman in the Valley, and she gave me a lot of advice. And she's like, CEO is the worst job. CTO is the best job. CEO is the worst job. And I'm like, you are 100% right.
Yep. Yeah. I think almost all of the other C-suite positions are more fun on a day-to-day basis than the CEO.
That's correct.
But yeah. 100%.
I haven't played the build in a week and a half, 2 weeks.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm lucky that I have a team that is playing the build, but I feel terrible about it and I'm going to do it. But believe me, I would rather play the build than deal with the tax credit and a bunch of other stuff that administrative stuff like, health insurance, right? Like we had to switch providers because our health insurance premiums went up. So I went to a small group plan, which plans aren't as good. So I had to like review I got 6 bids and I had to review them all. And so comparing each plan to each other, like they're not all standardized. So it was a nightmare. And I know some of my team really depends on health insurance. So like there's a lot of pressure to get it right.
Yep.
And I spent like a week doing that.
Yep.
And that's not fun at all.
Yeah. It's not only not fun. I think the other challenge is that so much of starting a company, and to your point, kind of starting a company of any scale and thinking about it as a company and being a business owner and running the business is not actually the background that most people as developers have, right? Like even logistically minded folks who come from production or whatever, like that worrying about a backlog is very different than learning about health insurance and all the different factors that go into health insurance and how that should apply into the total compensation package for a given individual employee in whatever jurisdiction. Like it's all
right.
like it's it condenses all of these different facets of what at a large business is many different departments into a single role. And then suddenly you, who used to be a producer or an artist or an engineer, have to go and figure it all out. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it is unexpected. I will say that I had a background I was a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
I was a litigator. Right. And one of the things about being a litigator is that in any given, I was a self-taught programmer first, and I wrote games in BASIC on my TRS-80 and Apple II. And then I'm like, yeah, I can't do this for a job. Like, I got to go get a job. So, but being a lawyer, being a litigator, one of the things that I really enjoyed about it was, for any given case, you had to learn the fundamental like legal structure behind that problem. So if it's a product liability or a copyright or a contract dispute or a tort, like a personal, like an injury, like you had to learn the structure behind it to be able to articulate the problem and then solve the problem. So like, I think that was a really good background for me because I'm like, okay, health insurance, how does it work? And I'm going to go figure it out. But that's not, you're right. And this, who has this problem too is fine artists. Like we have, my wife is a photographer, and a good friend of ours is a visual artist. And the business side of that is really hard, and it is not something that, if one of our friends is an artist and she's in her studio with charcoal and huge pieces of paper, and the logistics of organizing a show, sending out invites is not exactly sitting in your cold studio drawing on this giant piece of paper. So like, I totally get that. And because my wife is an artist, I've always seen the dichotomy of the art side and the business side, and what a gap that is, right? So, but it is something that I think if you want to start a company, depending on your goals, you have to come to terms with. And I find, especially right now, a kind of a huge pleasure and an inordinate amount of responsibility of like, I've given my team a place to work for the last, year and a half. And ideally for another 10 years or 20 years, and giving them a place where they can perform their craft and pay them for it. like especially during this time, I find very satisfying, especially during this time.
Especially during this time, for sure. As you went on that sort of learning journey, right? Like in figuring out all these things that it takes to run a business, some of which you had exposure to through previous lives, as well as through your sort of broader network. What did you find was the parts that you were most surprised you had to go and learn, or you found the hardest to learn and figure out? Sort of the biggest kind of learning journey that you had to go on once you decided to go down the path of starting a studio?
Oh, that's a good question. I wouldn't, I don't know what my wife would say, but I don't think I'm a classic extrovert. Like I really do like talking and socializing. Um, and I know a lot of people and I'm always interested in talking to people, but I was never necessarily good at parties or bars or meeting girls, like all that stuff was all pretty, um, it felt as soon as anything ever smacked of a transactional relationship, I would be spooked by it. And a lot of my natural social butterflyness was just about genuine curiosity about what other people did. And the thing I have found hardest to do was in some ways to force myself to socialize and network when it felt a little like it could be transactional. So like going to GDC parties, right? I don't think I'm going to go to one, right? I mean, I guess I should. Networking with venture capitalists, like things like that, that's really hard, right? I'm not a natural salesman. I'm a good salesperson, but I'm not a natural salesperson. Like I'm not going to insert myself into every discussion and be like, "Hey, I'm Bernie, and here's what I do." Right? That doesn't feel authentic to me. I love telling stories about what we're building. I love talking about the team and our work. Like I love it. I can pitch all day, right? I really could, because I really believe in what we're doing, and I think what we're doing is beautiful. But for me to go find the people to pitch to through this exhaustive kissing frogs till I find princes that's the hardest part for me. And people wouldn't necessarily think that because I tend to be pretty socially like comfortable. I can talk to anybody. I think the only person I've ever been really nervous to talk to is Shigeru Miyamoto. But that's it. Like I'll talk to anybody, and I think that's been really hard, right? Because you've got to meet a lot of people. You don't know who your benefactors and friends and allies are until you've talked to them. Like you don't. I've raised money from random places, from random conversations. Like a guy I used to work with a few years ago. He's like, "Why didn't you ask me?" And I'm like, "I had no idea." And he ended up being an angel, and he wrote like the biggest angel check we got, but it was almost by happenstance that we got back together again, because I wasn't going to go like ping my networks like, I want to raise money from all you people. Anybody got money? I'm like, that wasn't me, right? So that was hard. That's hard, and I think as a CEO, I have to go do that. That's my job. Make sure someone explained to me, as a CEO, you have two jobs: make sure the money doesn't run out and hire the right people. And I said to her, well, what about the product? And she said, did you remember the second point is hire the right people? Right. So if you got time, distant third, the product. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll do that.
Yeah. When you think about sort of that learning journey and that start of your journey where you're like, okay, I think I'm going to start a studio. You sort of end up in this space. You start learning all this stuff of how to fundraise and how to talk to all these folks. When you think about someone who's thinking about starting a studio today, or someone who is at that point where they're thinking about committing to the journey, what's the biggest sort of learning or advice you would have for them from your own experience?
There's a scene in Princess Bride when Wesley gets revived, and is it Physic who's like, we've got a Holocaust cloak, and he's like, why didn't you tell me? Like, why didn't you tell me this? Like, what are the assets we have? What are our liabilities? And I always remember that because I think about a realistic inventory of the assets you have in your career, right? I think that's really important. Who are the people you know? What are the projects you've worked on? What are the lessons you've learned? Where do you feel most comfortable? Where you don't feel comfortable, do you know people who can cover your flank? Random weak social connections. I think that's the most important thing, is to really understand what do you have in your tool chest before you start this, right? It's like you're equipping your party before you go out to the dungeon. Like, you kind of want to know, is this like an undead dungeon? So I should bring silver stuff and holy water, right? Like, you want to know, and you want to equip yourself properly. And you can't just charge into it. Because there's time for improvisation and leap of faith jumping, but not at your start. Like, I feel like you should really know what you got.
Yeah.
And like in my case, I worked at Oculus for a number of years, early on enough that my team's work had both a creative point of view and was unblocked by bureaucracy, right? It was just the founders of Oculus, a bunch of teams in my team. And I'm like, hey, we want to go do this thing. And they're like, okay, go do it. Right. I didn't have to convince anyone. I didn't have to convince Boz or Mark or any, it's just one person. And, I got to do a bunch of stuff with my team that had a real strong creative point of view, and they were like really lovely. And I worked on Plants vs. Zombies 2, and I worked on Destiny, and I worked on EverQuest, and I worked on Rock Band. So like, I have a lot of stuff that I can, put in front of an investor and say, like, write me a check. And even then it's super hard. But so that was part of what was in my inventory. What I don't have in my inventory is, like, I'm not a programmer. I'm not a designer. I can do design, but not at a, not an engine. I'm certainly not an artist. So those are things I didn't have, right? So what I did have was a bunch of stuff, and what I didn't have was other things. And I think being realistic about that, being really sober and clear, because this is a system that you have to work, and you can't go into it with just like blind hope. I mean, I guess you can. But I am not that kind of person, right? And I think if you want to hire people, attract people, you cannot be that kind of person either, because they want to know that you have all this stuff covered, so they can be creative and wild-eyed and ambitious, and they have someone covering that, like the execution part. So for me, it's really like knowing what you got and knowing what you don't got, and being honest, and don't think like, and even if you got a ton of stuff, you can't do all of it because you're one person. So I think that's the one thing, to be really ruthless about your stats and your inventory and your skills and and what your specialization is, and like, know what you got.
Now, as you go on this journey, did you end up with co-founders, or are you a solo founder?
I have co-founders. As I said, I wasn't, I'm not a programmer, so I needed a CTO for sure. And we had co-founders. I had two other co-founders, and I think of co-founders as people who are there with you at the beginning, whose kind of name and reputation you trade on to sell the company, to sell the vision, and who you give like more than 5% of stock to, right? Some big chunk. And we have 4 total co-founders. My CTO, a principal engineer, and a principal designer, which is a good combination, right? It is we had a 5th person who was a principal game designer, and he backed out because he actually has this neck injury that keeps him from putting on the headset. So we had 5, and we whittled up down to 4. And those were I wanted to cover all the bases of a core product team, right? CTO, engineer, and our CTO is a designer programmer. I have a UX designer and an engineer, and those were I feel like we covered all the main bases, right? To build something, to be able to execute, right? So start from an empty hard drive and start typing. And those were the people.
And just for our listeners, because I just realized that without this piece of context, part of your last answer may not make a ton of sense. The company works on VR games, and so headset doesn't refer to headphones; it refers to a whole VR headset.
Right. Right.
Yeah. When you think about it sounds like as you approach the idea of co-founders and your early team and what is the real initial seed of the company, sort of the easy way to represent it is that sort of like discipline breakdown. Well, we need someone who can write code. We need someone who can do design. We need, how do we get it up and running? When you think about what was important for those individuals as your co-founders, what else went into making that mix feel right? Like, as you thought about like all the engineers, obviously, you tend to prioritize people you have trust and working relationship with, but like as you think of the folks bearing the burden of this business alongside of you, what else went into that mix of the right co-founder team?
It's interesting because my co-founder, my CTO, I'd never worked with before, and he was introduced to me by someone we had both worked together with, a guy named Doug Church, who was kind of a secret superstar in the game industry. He was behind System Shock and Ultima Underworld and Thief, and like brilliant, excellent glass guy. And he's a close friend of mine who I was like, hey, you should do this thing with me. And he was like, well, I'm not ready to leave my job at Embark yet, but you should meet this other person. So like it worked out. And I think partially because Doug knows both of us, but that was the biggest unknown, is that I had not worked with my CTO before. But one of the things that appealed to me was he was a designer programmer, and he had done indie games, and he had done big AAA games. So he had this and he'd shipped things. So it was that sort of understanding that multiple hats need to be worn. I think that's a huge skill set that, if you come from, I don't know, Call of Duty, you may not have that, right? You don't really have that sort of, someone's got to do this job. I guess it's going to be me. Because of Call of Duty, there is someone doing that job, probably 20 people doing that job. I'll tell you though, of everyone I've worked on my team, there's only one person who I've shipped things with. Stephanie is my UX designer, and we were at Oculus together. And, shipping something with somebody, you see their best and their worst. And she's seen my best and worst. And as the producer, like all the attention, I'm sure I've seen her best and worst, but all the attention is on the producer, really, in a lot of ways. So she's seen my bad side and my good side, and she's okay with it, right? She understood it. And I don't think I hope she never really felt like, where's Bernie coming from? Like, she always knew where I was coming from. And when I wasn't at my best, I think she, of all people, gave me the most grace. And in the same way, I trust her because we have shipped a thing together. And I look back on the experience and never was like, oh, where was Stephanie at? Or like, I never doubted her ability to get to the finish line with me. And of all the people I have, that is really valuable as a CEO, because being a CEO is actually a pretty lonely job. And because there's no one to complain to, right? Because complaining is really, brings morale down. A lot of your fears and your anxieties, you got to keep to yourself. Like, what if no one buys our game? Like, I'm not going to say that to anybody. I just said it to you.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what I mean?
Yeah, so, 100%.
So having Stephanie around, I think, has helped me a lot because I trust her and she trusts me. And I think we have that like emotional closeness that comes from shipping multiple things together. And she found the experience rewarding. I mean, she said like shipping that stuff at Oculus was some of the best things, most enjoyable team experiences she's ever had. So that's the thing that I think I wish I had more like her. But now we're going to have, 14 people like her, right? Like, we're going to this thing and we're going to ship it, and we're going to it's kind of like taking your clothes off and jumping into a cold lake together. Like, we're all going to be naked and shivering, and we're going to know, we're going to see each other's, everyone's like strengths and weaknesses, how we performed under stress, and we're going to know better next time. Right. So I think it's going to be really great. And it's really, but as a founder, like, that's the one thing I feel like, God, it's so great to have that one person who is like your anchor, who knows you. And I had other folks that I'd worked with before, right? Like, I worked with our principal engineer on Orion, but we didn't ship something. Like, we tilted at windmills, we solved problems, but we never shipped something together. And I think that's the thing, right? That's really.
I mean, shipping, like, I think lots of people have said this, and I certainly have said it on multiple occasions, but shipping is the hardest thing ever in video games, and it's a miracle that literally any video game exists. And so, to your point, I think it's this really, that full cycle really brings into focus a depth of, going through the trenches, having that relationship, having that trust, and knowing how each person is going to navigate that journey, right? Um, as you sort of put together
Yeah.
that founding team and, you know, had worked with folks but hadn't shipped with most of them, and you're building this crew, you're thinking about, going into this really big effort together. What were the big discussions that made you think, okay, these are the, I haven't shipped with everyone here, but these are the right people to go on this journey with? And how did that end up manifesting, and how you guys make decisions and deal with disagreements?
So what I think, it's an interesting question, because we actually hired somebody to come do kind of like a leads workshop together, where we
Mm-hmm.
talked about our fears and anxieties and things we were afraid to say to each other. And, and it was, kind of over a weekend. We borrowed an office in New York. We all met in New York. For 1, 2, 3, or 5 of us. And I think that was really how we started talking about what we needed from each other and what we weren't getting. How do we ask for it, and how are we open to it? And also kind of understanding our own insecurities as people. The obvious one that people talk about is imposter syndrome, which I think is really just like an amalgam of a lot of insecurities. As I think it's kind of a bullshit. It's not bullshit as a top level thing, but I don't think it tells you a lot about like why you have this. So I think that's part of like, we brought in somebody to help us work through this. How do we talk to each other better? How do we understand each other's personalities? What are our trigger points? What are we good at? What are we afraid of? And for me, like a lot of it, having been through a lot of therapy and having a partner married for 23 years, like no feedback I've ever gotten is surprising to me, because my wife has said it to me already. Like I know what I'm bad at. I know what I'm good at. But interfacing with other people's sort of surface area of insecurities and emotions, I think is really hard, especially when none of us had done a startup before, and especially when we're doing something creative and we feel a lot of risk and pressure and, all this, the weight of leadership, and how do you transition from being like, a brilliant programmer designer to being a product lead? Like it's a mess of things. The one advice I give to people who join the team now is it's really important to create little vignettes of your teammates and remember what they're good at and remember what they're not good at, and calibrate your expectations, right? Because you assume everyone is trying to do their best. And if you're not getting something from me that you want, then why is that? Is it because I don't think you're important? It's probably not the answer, right? Probably the answer is I don't know how to give it to you. I don't know how to do it. I want to give it to you. I'm afraid to ask how to do it. Like, what do you really need? Like that. And try to lead with that as a diffusing force. So I think that's a lot of how we, and what also helped was the person we brought in, a guy named Mike Ranglian, who's done this ex Meta, ex Facebook. He said nothing that was happened that weekend was unique to our startup. He was like, every startup I've ever talked to has the same growing pains. And I found that very comforting, right? I'm like, oh, like we're not particularly terrible. It seems like we should know how to do this, but we don't. And it turns out like, yeah, a lot of people don't know how to do this. That's okay. And that made me feel like weirdly better, right? Like, anytime you get this group together, a new group of people together, the dynamics change, and you're going to have to adapt to it. So, and it's an ongoing process. Like I think we all continue to trip on each other's hot buttons, hot topics, and I think we will. One of the things I think as a CEO I have to think about is how do I change the working relationships to better accommodate people's strengths and weaknesses. So after we launch, I think I'll think about, okay, well, who really stepped up in what way, and who stepped up in other ways, and how do we rebalance the thing, right? I think that's important too, because the conflicts that happen in a team, everyone knows. And if you as leadership don't do something about it, it's like a tacit oh, this is okay. This inefficiency is okay. And this sort of headbutting was okay. Like, it's not okay. Like, we have finite resources and ability to change, but we should adapt the way we work to what we learned from shipping the game. So I think that's the next thing I think about.
If we jump back a little bit to the topic of fundraising, your favorite activity, most CEOs' favorite activity, to sort of you sort of told us a little bit about like preparing for that journey and how it doesn't, despite being someone who is good with people generally, that particular kind of interaction didn't come naturally. Could you tell us a little bit about how you're funded in whatever detail you feel comfortable sharing? And then also sort of the biggest difference between how it all went versus how you sort of thought it would go.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. We have some non-dilutive funding and dilutive funding, but I'll talk about the dilutive funding first. That is money that I've raised by giving away parts of the company. And we have 3 venture funds invested. We have a couple of angel syndicates, and we have a ton of angels. One of the first angel commitments I got was from Nate Mitchell, who is one of the co-founders of Oculus, and he was my manager. And that little vote of confidence helps people. And then the first institutional funding I got was through Ace Capital here in Seattle, and one of their LPs had worked with me on a project when I was at Bungie. And it's funny because he said, when I first met Bernie, I didn't know if I liked him because he was such a hard ass. Because it was three companies involved in Bungie, Harebrained Studios, and my friend's company were building Crimson Steam Pirates, and so he was the CEO of the tech middleware company, and he said, I don't know if I like Bernie because he's such a hard ass, but damn, like he got shit done. Like, he was no nonsense, take no prisoners, right? And I think for a CEO, one of the things that you want if you're funding them is you want a CEO that's going to run through brick walls, right, to make sure this thing happens. So when when I found out, well, this is one of the things, right, is that Josh Ayala runs a kind of a gaming meetup in Seattle, Conspire, and Josh knew that I was thinking about raising money and starting a company, and he said, hey, this guy is going to be here. He's a venture capitalist. He's looking to invest in games. And I was like, oh, I know him. Like, he said, you should show up and meet him. And it was like a rainy Seattle, and I kind of didn't want to go because it's Seattle and it's cold. But I got my ass out of my door. I went and I found him at the thing, and I pitched him gave him the elevator pitch, and he's like, this sounds great. I love your team. We should, let's talk about it some more. And I was like, great. And I kind of like hung out a little bit, ate some canapes, and I went home. So I forced myself out into that thing, and I met him, and it worked. Like, and that was the finding a couple of early believers that were willing to write a check or give time or both was really important. And I don't know. I was like, I guess I don't want to say that I'm lucky because I think my career had a lot to do with it. But having Nate as a manager and having my relationship with Todd at Bungie, like 10, 12 years ago, like that's when all this stuff paid off, right? It's a seed that I didn't even know I planted like 12 years ago that like, oh, here's the thing. So, and once you get money in, it's a lot easier. Once you get some money in, like it follows. I mean, it used to. It doesn't anymore. But it helps to have money in, right? And then VR Fund is is our lead investor, and I've known them just like I met Tipitet on Twitter because of all the stuff I'd shipped and the prominence of my work both inside Meta and in the community. Like, so that was also, he was also like, hey, if you want to start something, we should talk. So like all that was, it was 2023. I think it was a bad time to raise money, and I'm very proud that we did. So that's how we raised money, and then we took angel checks of varying amounts from a broad swath of people. Like since I work in tech, I know people in tech, and tech people have a little bit of money. So so that's how I raised the amount we raised. I think we are around 2.2 2.3 million in dilutive funding, and we have some non-dilutive funding as well. But it's not a huge amount, but it's a different era. Like, if this was 5 years ago, I would probably raise 30 million, right? In the zero interest rate days. But on the other hand, I don't know, I would have the quality of team that I do now, right? So it's I try not to think about what if, right? Comparison is a thief of joy. So, so that's how I raised the money. And partially because the thing we wanted to do, which was an AI-driven emergent behavior, procedural systems-based game, is not a game that like one person, I mean, unless you're Notch or something like that, it's not a game one person can easily make. So my ambition was not to build a game that was, 2 or 3 people. My ambition was to build a game that was going to be like $3 to $4 million budget, right? And because you need that sort of level of complexity for a game that, I have a dog. We have high expectations of what animals feel like, cats, dogs. And I wanted our pet to feel real. And that's not a trivial task. Like we did not, I had multiple people say like quadruped animation, good luck. Like, so we bit off a pretty ambitious product, right? So we had to raise money. Like we couldn't just do this. I couldn't find the quality of people just to like, let's give it a shot for a year and a half, right? Like it wasn't going to be sweat equity, I was also fortunate enough where people said, hey, do you have a demo? I'd say, go download BOGO, which was this early virtual pet demo I did for Quest, which, when Quest was announced, BOGO was the product that showed it off at Oculus Connect 4. So when people said, do you have a demo? I'm like, yeah, go download this thing, right? And it's a very kind of snide answer, but it was also very effective, right? Is that, yeah, Mark was on stage with this. This is what this was the best demo for Quest that they ever used before we launched. Like this, go play that. That's my demo. And they're like, oh, right. And I'll go read the pages of reviews from people. Right. And that was an easy, like, so I was lucky that I had something that I could point to as a demo without having to write a line of code.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, I think it's important to say, it's not luck. It's a series of, it's all to your earlier conversation. It's what are all the assets? What are all the things that you've built over your career? What are all the things you have in your pocket as you go and start this thing, right? And, on your journey, if you had decided to go and make another MOBA instead of this thing, right? Like that's, setting aside some of the assets you had, and you wouldn't have leaned in to that, the strength of what you had built as much. And
that's right.
So
that's right.
Was sort of the, like, as you went on this journey, to raise money in 2023, which was a hard time to raise money. What was sort of your biggest learning along the way, right? Like of how to fundraise. Like, I know that a bit the journey was hard because so much of it is you have to kiss a lot of frogs, and it's a very different sort of social interaction than you necessarily have the built-in instincts and stuff for. But what was the biggest learning going and raising money for your startup, and really for the first time in your career, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think the biggest learning I have is how do you iterate on the story you tell? My first pitch deck was much longer, and over time it got shorter and shorter. And I think I can give a pretty good pitch in 5 to 10 minutes now. Before it would take much longer. So I really I iterate in the same way that you iterate a game idea. I iterated the story I told, and in a lot of ways, it is like performance, right? You perform and you watch people's reactions, and you go like, okay, that landed, that didn't land. Let me move some things around. Let me pitch this to other people who just for advice and get feedback. Like, I think the story you tell, you have to love. Like, you have to really believe it, and I believe. I 100% believe in what we're building, and I think we could be the next Sims. Like, I think virtual pets are going to have a moment again. I think we live in a time where people are lonely and sad, and I kind of don't want more cortisol, adrenaline-inducing experiences. I love my dog, like, in a way that I would have. I have a kid, and I still love my dog a lot. Like, maybe not as much as my kid, but. But I still love my dog, like, a lot. So, the depth of, understanding why we love our pets, like I completely believe in our vision and the ability to succeed. So that kind of belief channeled through good storytelling and good performances, where it's almost like running a Broadway production off Broadway. Like you put it on, you see it, you workshop it, and you're constantly changing it. And that's the thing that I think I learned the most about, right? How hard it was to tell a story and how to refine it over time, till you like really get at it like right away. The other thing too is, every pitch structure has its pros and cons. Like I could go back to a less of a start with the lead and build a little more like romance into the build, like I did in my early pitch, a little nostalgia, a little emotion, but I can do both, right? And I think that learning how to tell a story in an effective way in 10 minutes is very hard. So, like people say, if you can't write poetry, you write short stories. If you can't write short stories, you write novels, right? Like you want poetry, you want to sell them with a few lines and make them feel this like sense of longing for what you're building. And you want to get to the poetry, I think, right? In the minimum amount of time. You don't have time for the novel. You don't even have time for the short story. I took a lot of English classes in college. You have to write poetry, right? And I think that's really hard.
I've heard that analogy before. I also like the potentially apocryphal Mark Twain. I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have time.
Right? Yeah, totally. It's hard, right? And I think there's no way to do it but workshop it. And I ran the pitch by people. I recorded it. I watched the videos. Like, it's hard to do, and I think that's really. I will also say that I looked at a lot of other companies' pitch decks. I had a friend who was a VC who shared them with me, and that's the thing is, like, if you share your pitch deck with a VC, like, you don't get a VC to sign NDAs, right?
Nope,
they're going to share your shit all over the place.
Yep.
Right? It's out there, and they were all not that good, and some of them were like well-funded games, and I'm like, this doesn't feel like a real story at all. And then I looked at the people behind it. Oh, right. That's how they raise money, right? It's like Work at Riot or whatever it was. Like, that's how they got the money. It wasn't the quality of the pitch deck at all, because I was expecting to see, like, this team raised $30 million. This pitch deck looks terrible. Like, it doesn't tell me a story at all. And I'm like, I realized, like, who did they raise money from? A bunch of VCs that were ex-Riot. Who were the founders? Ex-Riot. It's like, okay, that's the club. I guess that's how they raise money, right? And that's the other thing too, is that it made me feel better, but it didn't make my job easy, even though I think we had a really powerful pitch and a great deck. Like, it was still really hard, right? Because I'm not ex-Riot. Like, I'm not funding a MOBA or a hero shooter or something like that, and so I think that's really tough.
Yeah. I'm always, I don't know if jealous is the right word, and to your point, comparison is the thief of joy, is something that I take to my heart. But there is something that I always sort of have this moment of envy, I guess, when I see the announcement of some company that raised a bunch of money, and you look at it and you're like, oh, right, they're a founder who had some sort of exit, and the VCs were just like, well, I want more money too, and just pile on, right?
Yeah.
So just like,
I mean, I almost feel like the founder who had an exit, at least you're like, okay, you return money to your investors. Like Nate Mitchell started Mountaintop, and he had exited, he had helped exit Oculus. So, like, great, he did a thing, like, that's great. But the thing that drives me crazy is, like, if you worked at a big studio like Riot or Bungie or Valve or Blizzard, unless you were Jason Jones or Rob Pardo or Steve Snow, like, you didn't really help make League or Halo or Destiny into the World of Warcraft into the behemoth it was. Like, you got on a fucking rocket ship. Who are the people that started the rocket ship? So the people that sort of were employee 500 at, whatever League or Riot or Blizzard, like, how did they pitch? Like, they had no insight. And I'd argue, like, a lot of the ex-Blizzard startups, except for ArenaNet, all flamed out, right? Why is that? And then I look at my friend's studio, Supergiant, was started by a former student of mine, Amir, and I got Amir his first job in the game industry. So it's probably the one thing I did that should be recommended. Bernie was an awesome guy. He's like, he brought him here into the game industry from an English PhD program. That was sort of a little bit of a misfit group of people, like, XEA, a writer from GameSpot, like, they didn't trade on some, and they did not need to raise money, but they didn't trade on like, I was working on Madden or FIFA, like, I think those teams are the ones that should get funded, right? Not the like, I'm ex Bungie, my team is ex Bungie, my team is ex Riot. Like, I wish that weren't the case. It's interesting because I actually just had an online conversation with a strategic investor today, and he was like, well, we're not sure VR is really right for us because I'm not sure it's $1 billion franchise. And I said, I don't know how you go out and find $1 billion franchises, because I think all the $1 billion franchises, of some of which I've worked on, started out as pretty radically stupid ideas like EverQuest and Rock Band and Plants vs. Zombies, right? Like, these were not like classic $1 billion franchise ideas. So how do you go find $1 billion franchise? Why don't you go invest on first principles? Like, what is interesting in the market right now, right? And why don't you go do that? And he's like, yeah, you're right, but that's not how we work. I'm like, okay, that's cool. I mean, he gets it. Like, going to hunt $1 billion franchise feels like you're trying to hunt a Black Swan event. Like, that seems impossible. Like, by definition, a Black Swan event is unpredictable. And the $1 billion franchise you could go get is like Destiny, but that's super expensive to get into. And look where that's landed, right? Is like, Bungie's not in a great shape now. So like, it feels like a terrible cyclical death spiral to go find that, right? So I find the fundraising process, like, I would wish they would invest on first principles and not like the markers of $1 billion franchise, because I don't think it's so easy to find $1 billion franchise.
As you think about, going on the fundraising journey and other things that, all the things about doing a startup that is hard and a slog and mentally taxing, what do you sort of find to be really your biggest struggle on that journey as a CEO, as a founder? And how have you been approaching sort of living into that responsibility, supporting yourself along the way?
I think the biggest struggle is the uncertainty that exists after our runway runs out, right? Like, we're going to launch our game, we're going to have some runway after that, and I don't know what exists after that. Like, I hope we're successful. We're thinking about different ways of deferring risk. And, like, no one goes into a job knowing their money. It's interesting, right? Because you go to a job and there's a real chance you're going to get laid off, especially in the game industry, but even the tech industry. So it's the illusion of stability, but it's not stability. Mm-hmm. Here, we don't even have the illusion of stability. We're like, we have money that will last a certain point. And after that, this comes a point where you got to wind the company down or whatever it is. And that's hard to live with. I actually just yesterday I said, hey, do we really need a Figma subscription? And I went to it and I saw like there are a bunch of seats that we had that we're not even using, and like the last Figma bill is $300, and I'm like, no, we're gonna kill all these. The one person who needs it's gonna keep access to it. We're gonna kill everything else, and so like I saved $100, $200, whatever it is, and that's part of the CEO's job, right? I feel like the penny pinching person where I tell everyone you should spend money like it's your own, and then when I get some like cost estimate for some outsourcing, I push them on it, and it turns out they could have saved a little more. And I think that that's the thing that I don't want to penny pinch people, but I also don't, I always say, like, if you were spending your life savings on this game, would you spend this much money? And they're like, oh, I don't know, it's a lot. I'm like, then why did you bring this to me? Like, and that's the thing that I think I find, trying to save money as much as possible to extend our runway. I mean, I've gotten people to tell us, like, you're spending too much money on this game. And like, by what metric? One VC said, you're spending, your burn rate's too high. Is it? Like, can you judge burn rate without judging the output of that burn rate? Right? It's a return on investment. So the investment is high, but the return is also high. So that's the kind of thing that I feel like I've got to tune out and be comfortable with what I'm spending. I think our burn rate is I've heard other people say your burn rates is very reasonable. I'm like, so it's you get whiplash on all this stuff, right? You have to filter out. You have to let a lot of the negative stuff kind of wash off you, but you have to know what negative stuff like, I hadn't realized this. I should do this better, right? So you have to let some stuff go, but really absorb other stuff. And I don't always know like which is the right thing. Like maybe my burn rate's too high. Maybe I should hire a bunch of programmers in Ecuador. I don't know. I mean, so I'm constantly second guessing myself, I guess, and my team would probably be surprised to hear that because I come across as fairly decisive, but like I second guess myself a lot. Like, is this the right thing? I don't know. Seems right.
But again, that's the part of the CEO job that I think amplifies that second guessing and amplifies the loneliness is that other side of leadership where to your team, you can't be second guessing. And so you have to represent it as like, here's the thing, I've looked through it. This is what it is,
Yeah. Yeah. I've learned a lot from, I race bicycles on the track on the velodrome. And I've learned a lot about like being present and making good decisions. And if it's not a good decision, like letting it go and keep like, trying to regroup, not to dwell in the past too much, not to look too far in the future, not to look too far in the past. Because what you have is the moment. And, what happens in 2 laps doesn't matter, right? Like, because by the time 2 laps comes, like the world will look very different. So like make good decisions now based on what you understand and your learning patterns. And that has helped me a lot, like to really control my controllables, not to stress too much about like what I can't control. Like I can't control whether, the VCs have raised money from their LPs or not. Like I can only give them the best story I can. And if they say no, they say no. On the other hand, I expect everybody I pitch to say yes. Like, how could you not? I'm always surprised. Like, well, how could you not do this? Like, I pitched A16Z, and they're like, we're not sure. And then they funded some mobile pet game, and I'm like, it's not a big brand, it's not a big license. Discovery on mobile is terrible. Like, and in VR, the pet feels real. Your brain is telling you it's in your house and it's jumping on your sofa and it's sleeping next to you. Like, what is more powerful than the illusion of an animal who loves you in your house? Like, oh my God, it's so good. Like I pitched a VC at last GDC and he said he almost cried at it. He was so moving. That guy didn't actually write a check. And I was like, well, what do I have to do to get you to write a check?
Anyway, so all this
all this money stuff is, really like break down in body racking sobs. Like all that stuff I think is really like, is really challenged, like that's the stuff that I think is like watching the money and being really careful. And I don't know, money is I really took to heart this idea of don't let the money run out. So, but also like, I don't want to nickel and dime people either. I've talked to contractors and I said, what is the lowest amount of money that I can pay you that makes you feel valued for your time? Like, let's not haggle, right? What's the low? Because in reality, what if I pay you an extra 10 grand and we don't ship, like this compounds over, right? Like 5 people, 10 grand is $50,000. That could be like a half a month of burn rate. Like if we don't ship, what I pay you doesn't matter. And that's how I talk about it is like, I want people to feel their worth, but I also don't want to pay a penny more than that, And if that number's too high, then the number's too high. We part ways. Like, I don't want to negotiate. Like, I don't want to be a car dealer. You know what I mean? And you don't come to an indie to get paid Bungie or Valve salaries. You come to an indie for like the payoff of hitting it big with something magical. So I don't know.
Well, and actually shipping a product, whereas at larger studios, shipping is an uncertain thing at best.
Yes, right. And feeling like you got to put your thumbprint on it, right? Like really affect it. A team of 15, 14 people, something someone says, like, we'll make it into the game. At Bungie, like, I don't think, I worked on Destiny. Well, that's not true. I think I definitely had a thumbprint on the game, but I worked on Horizon Worlds, which is that thing that Mark is really, metaverse-y. And I felt like I was unable to affect that product at all, like for a lot of reasons. And I think there's nothing less satisfying, no matter how much you get paid, to not feel like you can put your mark on it, like your thumbprint on it a little bit, right? you can look back to and say like, I helped that thing. And on any studio, you can help a lot of things, which is great. I think that's what, one person who just came on recently thanked me and said, you brought back the joy of game development to me. I didn't think that was possible. And because they're able to sort of touch so many parts of the game and really have discussions with everyone. And she was at Bungie before. She's like, I could never do that there.
So we've talked a lot about like a bunch of ways in that this journey is hard, especially for the CEO, especially for the person sitting in that seat, the human going through this journey. So when you think about that weight and that effort and those things that you put out, where do you find the support for yourself as a human to navigate the stress, the ambiguity, the challenges, right? Like obviously there's learning and there's all the ways that you get the job done, but how do you as a human find support for yourself along this journey?
Part of it is people. Like I have one of our advisory board members who helped me get our first check. Has been super helpful on the business side. A friend of mine who's been an informal advisor, she's been giving me advice. She's a former CTO of different Silicon Valley startups. So I get a lot of advice from people. I also kind of draw some more boundaries. Like I went to Paris for 3 or 4 days and 4 nights, and I use that time to like spend with my wife. And I didn't look at work really much at all. I mean, not 0, but like 10%. And I'm not going to be that person who's working 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. Like I don't have the ability to do it. Like I'm older. And I don't know if it's I don't have the ability or I have no desire to do it. And I think that, again, of bike racing, right? I think there's a mythology that you can just go hard all the time. And it's not true. Like you can't go hard all the time. You have to make, going hard at the right time wins me races. I've won races because I went hard at the right time. But maybe my total power output wasn't, my best. So I think that is something really important. So drawing boundaries for myself, focusing and really committing, finding others. I've talked to other CEOs. They're super helpful, giving me advice, giving my team advice on technical and design areas, like leaning on my community and my friends, I think has been really helpful. And actually playing the build and seeing what our progress is really helpful. So I feel like, maybe that's kind of a generic answer. But I definitely go, and I'm lucky to be able to do that. Like I go touch grass once in a while. I step away from the computer. And I feel a little guilty about it still, but it makes me better, right? My coach for bike racing, she builds into my schedule, Friday's a rest day, off the bike completely. And if my body needs it, my brain needs it too, right? Like you can't always be doing it. So that's the stuff that I think is really understanding the organic nature of the human machine, and we're not robots, and we just can't like crank up the volume. So I think that has helped me a lot, but it is fundamentally a lonely job.
So we've sort of come to the end of the main part of the interview. And before we sort of jump into a little bit of a lightning round, I have the incredibly unfair question that I ask everyone at the end of this. So having gone on this journey and learned and grown into the role of CEO and done this stuff in the future, so like let's move regardless of the outcome of your current enterprise, of the game, of the company, go beyond, go 3 laps into the future. Would you found another company? Would you go on this journey again?
I said no. And someone told me they didn't believe me. So I say no because I kind of I would like to work with this, I'd like to work in this particular group of people and product forever. I'm also in my 50s, so I don't know how much time I have left, to really gun it again. I would say no, half conviction. Like I could see, let's say I had a successful exit and I was able to build a team a little more with less friction and raise more money, and it wouldn't be such a slog. Yeah, I guess I would, but it's hard to it's hard to envision that future because it's not here. So I'll say no, asterisk.
No, but ask me again in 3 laps.
Yeah. ask me again in the future.
Amazing. So the way I like to close out every interview is with what I call the introspection lightning round. These are a series of questions that I actually asked folks that I was considering for co-founders very early in the conversation. Usually even like one of the first things I would say, here's homework, go and do it, come back and let's share answers and discuss them. And so I'm going to ask you these as sort of a lightning round. And the way I always like to start is, what is your superpower?
I think my superpower is very unalloyed determination. Like I'm pretty driven. I'm driven. I'm not going to say pretty driven. I'm not going to like caveat. I'm driven and competitive. And I'm a direct, like a beeline to the bike racing metaphor. I'm a beeline for the finish line. Like when I see the finish line in a bike race, like my eyes are gigantic. And I feel that way. Like I'm very, very driven that way. Nothing will get in my way. I'm very resolute. I think that is the one thing that I think is my very clear. And it's different than being ambitious necessarily. Like, but I am very resolute and driven. Yes.
Outside of your superpower, what are your biggest strengths?
I think I'm very curious. And I love my team. Like I am hard on my team, but I will defend them to the death. So I think loyalty. And then curiosity. Like I think I am a curious and flexible thinker. You know, I like to learn new things. I'm always interested in what's going on. Like I'm nothing that I think is beyond my reach. Like I'm always interested in what's going on. Yeah.
And the flip side of that is, of course, what are your greatest weaknesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think my greatest weakness is the flip side of my determination is that it can step on people as I'm moving forward in ways that I did not want or anticipate or think clearly about enough. So I can be insensitive. I can be, insensitive and kind of, I don't know, too blunt. Like I'm a former lawyer from New York City, right? And that's not a good, for West Coast is not a good combination. So I think that's my biggest weakness is I can ride over people's feelings more roughly than I want, and given like thought I shouldn't have done.
What are your stress reactions?
My stress reactions are probably to cut people off and step on things. Like I want to kind of control and make decisions quickly and move on. My stress reaction, I think, is to talk and preempt other people from talking, right? So I think one of the things I've learned is you should make sure that people have had their say, listen, and then make your decision. And even if you know the right answer, doesn't matter. Like you've got to let people, you got to absorb it first. So my stress reaction is to like jump to the right answer in a way that I think preempts at least people talking through it, because I always feel like time is short. Like, oh, look, I know the right answer. Let's just fucking keep going. So I think that's my like my stress reaction is to like short circuit that.
And what are your upkeep needs?
What's an upkeep need?
Yeah, so the example I always give is my own, which is in a work setting, when I do some sort of work, usually like in the role that I'm in, it's a lot of times a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint presentation or something, or a write-up for the team. And I put it out to the team, to someone who it's like they're the customer of the artifact. I need feedback that it's useful, like not necessarily deep, detailed feedback. I don't need them to immediately drop everything, go through, but like within a reasonably short period of time, I need them to say like, hey, I took a look, it looks valuable. I will get you more feedback later. And that acknowledgement that I didn't just waste my time. I didn't just go and do something that was unproductive. Otherwise, I start to like vibrate intensely and my stress and anxiety goes up and I start bothering people like, hey, was this useful? Was this useful? Can I do it differently? Like, and so that's sort of that upkeep need that I shared with my co-founders. I'm like, hey, if I ever give you something, whether it's a spreadsheet or you need to give me my good boy points, otherwise I will go insane.
I have something similar in that I want, if I send something off into the team, I expect that it will never be lost, right? Even if it's not something you do, like, hey, Carl, you should think about adding horns to this creature. Like, even if you don't do it, I want to know that it has landed and you thought about it and you've disposed of it properly, one way or another. Like, I don't want it to be like, oh, I forgot about that. That's what that drives me crazy, right? Was like, look, and it's funny because you say this, because one of the things I realized that now I know why people say CEOs are assholes, is because if you don't give them the right upkeep, they will find ways to make it happen, and you may not like it, but it's what they need to do. So I felt that way about, like, I would like, I'm going to send it off into the team. I want someone to treat it like with particular care, and whether you act on it or not, whether, yep, we can have time for it or we don't have time for it, it's not, like, I want to know it's not lost, because I've asked the team for things and it just gets lost. And I feel like, oh my God, like, and I could never imagine Mark Zuckerberg saying that. Like, when Mark says something, 20 people jump to his attention, and obviously it's a very different dynamic, but I would like it to be like, hey, this is I spent time on this. Like, if it's not useful for you, fine, let me know. If it is useful for you, then do something with it. But don't be like, I lost it. That gets me. It's a little bit different than yours. I don't need the feedback. I just want to know that it has found a place, or it's been disposed of. It doesn't live in this, like, liminal state of, like, Schrodinger's cat, right? Is it alive? Is it dead? I don't know.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this episode and sharing all of the answers and your journey. Before we close it out, is there anything you wanted to share with the audience, promote, shout out people, or anything like that?
Yeah, my startup, Windup Minds, is going to ship a virtual pet. I hesitate to call it a game, sort of somewhere between a game and a lifestyle, called Stay Forever Home on the MetaQuest store. And if you love Tamagotchis or Nintendogs, or ask your mom for a cat or a dog, and your dad or mom said, well, who's going to take care of it? And the answer was, like, you're not getting a pet. Come check it out. I think we are at windupminds.com/wishlist. You can go to the wish list on the store. And if it gives you, like, warm, fuzzy Nintendogs vibes, buy it and check it out and let us know what you think.
And if someone listened to this podcast and heard something where they really want to follow up with you or ask you for advice or get in contact with you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
LinkedIn, Bernard Yee, LinkedIn. Reach out to me. I'm always happy to give advice. And if I have time, time's always precious, but I certainly view genuine inquiries much more favorably than some outsourcer trying to sell me, like, mobile development resources in, some other continent. Like, so I get a lot of those now. But yeah, if there's anything I can, if anything is I can provide help to people's careers or something, an insight, like, your mileage may vary, and I do the best I can.
Well, thank you again for joining us. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the entire episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends or anyone you think could benefit from it, and leave us a positive rating or subscribe. This episode was edited by Christopher Delano, music by Jake Hall, who's available for composer work in games. And if you're interested in learning more about the Game Founders support community, go to gamefounders.org or email me at carl@gamefounders.org. Thanks so much.